Welcome, everyone, to the September Beyond the Algorithm Reading Club. I'm Kari Weaver, the Program Manager of the Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning Initiative here at the Ontario Council of University Libraries. And today I am so excited to be joined by Dr. Jessie Hall. Jessie is currently the Cowling Postdoctoral Fellow at Carleton College Philosophy Department and holds a PhD from the University of Toronto, where she previously completed a postdoctoral appointment at the Schwartz Reisman Institute of Technology and Society, in the Institute for History and Philosophy of Science and Technology. Her research interests are philosophy of computing, epistemology, and today we are so delighted to welcome Jessie to speak with us on the topic of trust and artificial intelligence. Jessie, our reading this month begins with the question, can we trust AI? And while I'm sure we're going to unpack this in some more detail during our conversation, could we start with this question and could you share your thoughts on it?
Yeah. In many ways, this is a really difficult question to start with because there's so much you want to sort of like unpack to make sense of it. But I guess to start, I want to be a irritating, pedantic philosopher and say, I think we can trust AI in the sense that it's possible, right? And I think the thing that we're really reaching for when we're asking ourselves this question, can we trust AI, is really, should we trust AI? Like, would our trust be misplaced were we to depend on AI for something? And with respect to that question, it's this is the much more difficult question, right? Because the morally entangled, the normatively entangled questions are always the much more sticky questions. And being a pedantic philosopher, I guess the best I can sort of offer is, it depends, but it depends on lots of things that hopefully we can sort of like organize by thinking about it really carefully. So, it depends on the stakes of the situation in which we're hoping to rely on an AI. It depends on the type of question that we might be asking of the AI. It also depends on us. Like, it depends on who is making the inquiry or who is depending in a lot of different ways. So obviously there are stakes to depending as well as stakes to the, whatever outcomes, whatever tasks we ask an AI to do. But there are also sort of like epistemic conditions. What does the inquirer know? That kind of thing. And I think that if we're even going to try to answer, can we trust AI or should we trust AI more specifically, we need to do a lot more work to sort of sort out that landscape of contingencies and context that might inform on our judgments about the can and should we judge AI that are different from case to case. So that's the sort of like almost like politician's answer to the can we trust AI question. Maybe I'll also say, the reading for this week is to some extent talking about what trust involves. And
Mhm.
my take is that I think that asking questions about what we think trust really is might be missing the boat a little bit.
Mhm.
That this can sort of devolve into just a semantic conversation about what we think trust is when we have these far more pragmatic and perhaps more pressing issues about the appropriateness of depending on AI, whether we call it trust or reliance. Um, yeah.
Yeah. And certainly for many of the library workers across our consortium, they have a lot of concerns about kind of that should we trust AI question, both within their own work, but also thinking of the kinds of supports that libraries provide for especially students who are still very much in a place where they are sort of developing their sense of self and
Yes.
their sort of level of expertise and knowledge, and are just starting to sort of join discourse communities within certain academic disciplines. And so, it's certainly, we can see from experience that it's very sort of seductive or persuasive that AI is there, and well, should we use it? I don't know, but I can sort of justify why I might in various ways.
Yeah.
And maybe sort of not always thinking about what the trade-offs of that are actually. And sometimes that trade-off, or in a lot of ways, it can seem like calculating that trade-off to the individual as the individual who's experiencing it can be particularly difficult.
Yeah. 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 I mean, this actually reminds me, I didn't expect to bring this up, but it reminds me of a paper I recently sent out about the sort of like cognitive offloading thing in the
Mm-hmm.
learning context. And I think it's a great example of like asking ourselves about the inquirer themselves or the depender themselves, because, a student depending on like a chatbot AI or something to tell them things might be a really bad scenario from a certain normative standpoint if what we want them to do is like have good practices of research and verification or something if they're just taking the AI's word for it. But it might be different for somebody who's like an expert who can see a lot more um, sort of like context in the background of whatever output they're getting from chatbot or the same chatbot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that that's sort of an interesting starting to unpack this a little bit, is that focus on who the person is using the AI really, I think, is it speaks to a lot of our experiences and sort of concerns
Yeah.
in libraries, because we in fact are dealing with people from all sorts of different positions and positionings and backgrounds and levels of expertise in the work that we do, even just within the higher education environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to move us on to our next question of discussion. So Mitchell, in our reading, argues that complete transparency may actually undermine trust because trust requires a degree of vulnerability. Do you find this argument convincing, and how does it challenge assumptions we have in libraries that more transparency is always better?
Yeah. So I think there's a number of things going on here. I mean, I mentioned a little bit that we can sort of get bogged down in a semantic discussion about what trust is, and this is maybe sort of like getting off topic. I think Mitchell's goal is kind of to respond to a lot of literature in kind of like the trust in AI space, which is pulling from like a bigger tradition in social epistemology, and sort of saying, what's the nature of trust? Is trust precluded from AI? Like, is AI like the wrong object to be talking about trust as applicable or whatever? And so I think Mitchell is just trying to say, like, look, the opacity of an AI doesn't sort of like remove the possibility of trusting AI. I mean, he does go on to sort of try to convince us as well that there might be reasons why it is appropriate, like the more positive argument that it is appropriate. Um, but to be fair to Mitchell, again, yeah, I would say he's just trying to say that opacity doesn't preclude preclude trust. That maybe transparency is sort of something that we would need in lieu of trust.
Mm,
But so as for the sort of norm and the standard um, in research in general, and certainly for library sciences and information sciences and many other fields. I think that I think that the like Mitchell's thesis is actually compatible with the view that more transparency is better, but it might entail something like, well, we don't want trust to be sort of part of the picture of epistemic inquiry or something that trust probably isn't good enough or something.
Mm,
Right? That might be one way to interpret that norm of transparency, that we don't take things on trust, that we like
mm.
trust but verify or something as the saying goes. And I think that saying's popular. I think Mitchell would say that that's not trust, right?
Mm.
That if you're verifying, then you're doing that sort of prompted transparency thing, and so you're sort of like foregoing trust. Now, the interesting thing about that is I mentioned sort of like this broader older literature, well, current and older
Mhm.
literature in social epistemology. Many social epistemologists would push back and say, like, look, that's an ideal that is not possible to achieve,
Mhm.
right? That we always have to take some people's word for some things where we just don't have access to other means of verifying. Um, and so at that point, I think the question becomes, is AI is taking AI's word for it like taking somebody's word for it or some person's word for it, or are there some important differences? And maybe that's getting a little beyond the question here, but I suppose just to bring it
Yeah.
back to the original question, I don't think the norm of transparency is incompatible with the view that Mitchell is arguing for, um, that trust is not precluded by opacity or something, but that there are much more sort of like needly issues here playing out in the background. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that is part of the challenge when we're thinking about AI and how it relates to transparency and trust. Like it's also sort of not all AI is a monolith. Like there are different types of AI for different purposes, and some AI models and applications sort of inherently are a bit more transparent in how they are function or how they were trained or like even what the specific like application or use would be in ways that I think probably are more consistent with what we would think of as transparent
Yeah.
in kind of information sciences and library sciences. So I know one of the challenges that I've seen across our consortium in talking with library workers is that a lot of times when people are thinking about AI, they're thinking about sort of one or two large frontier models that maybe are licensed by their particular institution, and that's the whole context for AI. And so getting into some of these sort of more nuanced or needly issues then becomes difficult because it maybe Mitchell actually does have a convincing argument if your whole context for AI is Microsoft Copilot, and the way that that's sort of influencing your experience of it. Um, but but it's possible, or maybe we should leave open the possibility that if we sort of take a more expansive view on the topic, that we might we might find some ways in which AI becomes more transparent, and other ways in which it does not.
Yeah, I think it's a great point too, and maybe goes back a little bit to the point about the user too, right? That even if you like if you have a sort of mile high view of how a large language model
Mhm.
works or something, that might sort of like translate to greater transparency for that user, and that might influence how they look at and the
Yeah.
degree to which they trust, I suppose,
Yeah.
the particular outputs that they're getting from a system. You know, and then like with respect to the epistemic context of the question you're asking it, some other um, domains in which machine learning that we like to call AI is being used are like, the medical context, like diagnostic imaging and that kind of thing. And there may be sort of like a narrower sort of set of variables that
Yeah.
can help somebody who's using this to have some insights about the degree to which they can have confidence in the AI, kind of independent of what the AI might say about its own
Yeah.
confidence. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So Mitchell goes on to suggest that opacity alone should not prevent trust if there's evidence of reliability. Thinking about the higher education landscape more broadly, and specifically around teaching and learning or research, what kinds of evidence would be sufficient to trust an AI system and ensure that reliability?
Yeah, I think this is the key question. And the way that I think about it is sort of like, what are the conditions for warrant for trust or reliance on AI? And I think, reliability in sort of like the broad sense, like how often does this thing do what we want it to? Like, I don't know. I think the best performers on ImageNet that haven't like memorized it. So the ImageNet is like this huge like collection of images for testing and training image recognition or image classification systems. I think the best ones that aren't so big that they can memorize it can get to around 92% um, correct classifications or whatever. Um, and that level of reliability might be good for image classification. But again, I mean, I think this keeps going back to the same thing. It sort of depends on what the question is, right? Image classification, fine, but there are lots of other kinds of queries that we are increasingly approaching reliance for AI on. And we should be asking ourselves maybe in a more regimented way, like what conditions would we care about for this particular task? And so this is actually something I've been thinking about a little bit lately, and I just sort of have like a sketch of an idea of how this would go. And so I've mentioned both the inquirer, like what is the status of the inquirer, and also what is the status of the query or the task that the AI is being asked to do. And I think that at least at a very sort of uh, basic and primitive level, like our first sort of pass at trying to be able to answer this question, what conditions would warrant trust? We have to sort out what the inquirer knows about the question that they're asking. So things that I think are probably important. I mean, obviously, the inquirer presumably doesn't know the answer to the question. That we can
Right.
probably leave aside, right? Though if we wanted to give an exhaustive account of this, we would probably have to include all of those logical possibilities. But then it would be helpful for the inquirer to know about the question whether it is verifiable in principle, right? Whether
Mhm.
it's discoverable in principle at all. So like an example of that, like, maybe in a faraway planet there is a mountain and it's an orbit locked planet and we never see that side of the planet or something. There may or may not be a mountain there. It's verifiable in principle in that there is a truth of the matter, but separately we might say that, there's a question as to whether it is discoverable
Yeah.
practically, right? So we've got, is it discoverable at all? Is there a fact of the matter? Is it discoverable? And then do we have a reason to believe that it could have been discovered by now, right?
Mhm.
So the inquirer may or may not know these things about their question, right? So the in principle question, like people ask AI lately, all kinds of difficult math questions, some of which we don't even know if they are answerable, right?
Yeah.
If there is a proof for them, if they're answerable. Um, so the inquirer can sort of like end up in different places with respect to those questions. And my sense is that we should we should probably be very circumspect about relying on AI in cases where we don't know whether something it has an answer, whether it's even discoverable, and maybe we should even withhold trust when we don't know whether it is likely that it has been discovered or not.
Mm.
But to bring this down to real life, I was trying to think of examples of this, and I recently, for some reason, had occasion to try to look up how many insect species there were. And there's a huge sort of range of the
Mm.
estimate for the number of insect species. So it's like somewhere between like 10 million and 30 million different insect species. And there's also some unclarity about whether this is like the whole history of the Earth or just alive right now. It's a huge range. So then we sort of have these questions once we figured out, like, is it discoverable? Is it likely that it could have been discovered, given that it's discoverable? We have this issue where there's often these sort of like gray space kind of questions, like a question about how many insect species there are. And at that point, I think we also need to sort of ask ourselves, you know, are there reasons why I would trust an AI as much as I trust an entomologist about this? Or are there reasons why I wouldn't trust perhaps more precisely, I wouldn't trust an AI as much as I trust an entomologist? Um, and I think that having some scaffolding like that, having some sort of like systemic way to sort of go, what kind of question is this? What does the person know about it? Can at least a little bit inform on how to approach this question of the conditions for
Mm.
warrant for trust. One last thing I'll say, and I don't know like how successful I can be at sort of defending this, but my intuition, at least, is that I have reasons to trust the entomologist over the AI about how
Mm.
many species of insects there might be. And the reason is because I think that and this has to do with not being maybe committed to trust. The reason is that I think the entomologist has more modes of verification at
Mm.
her or his disposal than the AI, who is just sort of like processing linguistic representational data to give me some like likely um, sequence of strings,
Yeah.
right? And so maybe this points a little bit in the direction that in order to take somebody's word for it, we're not exactly trusting if trusting is about opacity. What we are is sort of like uh, assessing the picture for signs of good evidence and signs of good reason. And so maybe that the opacity of AI with respect to those signs of good reason and signs of good evidence are disqualifying of a certain level of dependence or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Your discussion, especially of the entomologist, makes me really think in in library science, we have it's called the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education. And it has a number of pillars that sort of indicate a person is or is moving toward a high level of information literacy. And one of the big pillars there, I'm getting to why, is that authority is constructed and contextual. And one of the things that sort of strikes me about that, both in your discussion and sort of that big idea around sort of authority, is that we sort of have an understanding of what the authority basis of the entomologist is, but we don't necessarily have an understanding of what the authority basis of the AI is. And in some contexts, maybe that matters, and in
Mhm.
others, perhaps not.
Yeah.
But sort of the key there is being able to distinguish
Yeah.
when when the context calls for sort of that authority that has a basis and
Yeah.
grounding, and that authority that doesn't, and sort of how do we tell the difference between those two.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, um, and it's interesting because if I think that if certain epistemologists were listening to me, they'd be like, but what about the entomologists? They're just learning from a bunch of written stuff too. What's the difference
Yeah.
in principle? And I think this is where the logical positivists had a really good insight. So for those who might not know, the logical positivists are sort of like located in this group called the Vienna Circle in the interwar period in Vienna. And one of their big ideas was sort of that what was truth apt at all, what had to be empirically verifiable. And now there's lots of hubbub about that, about whether that was a good way to talk about what is truth apt or about what knowledge is or whatever. But I think that they were really onto something with the intersubjective scrutiny aspect of it, right? And so when we talk about authority that has some basis or some grounding or something, I think implicitly there is this idea that we could appraise, the sources of this person's claims, not just take their word for it, right?
Yeah.
That there is that possibility, and that the contingencies in which they're operating are, in the ideal case at least, sort of making it more likely that they're telling us something that has these intersubjectively appraisable corroborations,
Yeah.
but not likely. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting. And I imagine it's something that is sparking a lot for our listeners, as they're sort of thinking, because these are very sticky issues, and especially when we have a student in front of us, they're stressed, they have an assignment due,
Yeah.
helping people to sort of connect with and make those decisions, in a lot of ways, especially because so much of our information has gone in the direction of being available in a digital environment. Does a journal article feel and look desperately different from an AI output? Not especially.
Yeah.
And so, kind of how do we continue to unpack that? And it does seem like, back to our, you know, question and discussion around our first point of conversation, it does to a certain extent come back to the individual,
Mhm.
and which is always, it it puts a lot on the individual, but
Yeah.
perhaps that is in fact the level at which a lot of the responsibility for this does lie.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, and this is maybe the philosophical persnicketyness getting at me, but it's I worry about it becoming an issue of responsibility. I like
Mm,
my instinct is to be like, can we engineer some way to make these things more obvious somehow, so that because people don't know what they don't know, right? Like
yeah,
that's just, it's almost a tautology or something, but um and so you can get the sense of impending doom, like that there's no way to sort of correct this thing, which is why I think I'm grasping for sort of a framework, like what type of question is it, that maybe we can
Yeah.
sort of like get to a point where we are making those things part of the context of the answer, or the task domain, or the task event itself or something, so that the person who's in the position to depend on the system is aware, is made aware,
Yeah.
um, instead of having to just know somehow.
Yeah. All right. I think that's a perfect transition, actually, transition
Okay.
point to our next question, which is that Mitchell's article distinguishes between type transparency, knowing how reliable a system generally is, and token transparency, understanding exactly how a specific decision was made. Which form of transparency is more important when working with or evaluating AI tools and their outputs?
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to sound like a broken record because I really think it depends again, right,
Mm,
on the task domain. And so there are some domains where you can't have token transparency for reasons of the kind of task that you're asking the thing to
mm,
perform, right? So the example that always comes to mind for me is uh, sonar undersea ordnance detection. So like trying to find sea mines, right? You
yeah.
only know if you found one when it goes boom, right? And your sort of capacity for training a thing in the first place or whatever is limited by by these very practical
Mm,
limitations. And so the best you can ever have is a kind of second-hand type transparency, right? That it did pretty well on these cases where we use these sonar signals that look like the signals that we think are the signals of sea mines. And so we deploy it, and that's the best we can do. And in that case, the cost benefit is in favor of using that instead of nothing, right?
yeah.
And so in that case, type transparency is good, and we're sort of in a bind by pragmatic concerns to rely on that thing because we prefer it to nothing.
Yeah.
Um, as for, I mean, we can just sort of like come up with examples all day, but we were talking about students, and in the educational context, I had the unfortunate experience of catching a number of AI generated essays in the last few terms. And one of the big giveaways is like quotes and pages for quotes.
Mm,
So large language models are not very good at generating quotes, partly because there are like copyright issues there, and did they
right.
just memorize the text or whatever? And they just do a little bit of hallucinating when it comes to pointing to exact pages. So um, a student who's trying to cheat on an essay or something would probably want transparency with respect to that token task of this is the page or whatever. They're probably better off um, just checking because they can't
Yeah.
have that token transparency, right? But even in this case, it sort of shows that the actual task, if we just sort of like zoom in on that um, that piece of evidence that would give them away or whatever, um, it's it's complicated both by what is possible and also what is possible and what is pragmatic, and what it is the user actually wants. Um, if you think about like the medical context, again, we have these sort of epistemic limitations, kind of like the sea mines example, in like diagnostics, for example. Um, you want something which has good type transparency. You can't have the token transparency, but we have very difficult questions to contend with, I think, in the case where we mostly care about token transparency when things go wrong in that case, right? In that scenario
Mm,
where it said I didn't have cancer and I did or something.
mhm.
Um, and those sorts of tasks, I think we want the token transparency. in those cases, not just the type transparency. And this is sort of the case where we have to ask ourselves different questions in light of these practical limitations that we can't have that token transparency. You
Yeah.
know, are we better off still using this tool even though this happens sometimes? Is it acceptable if we reason on the basis that it is better overall than some other strategy? Um, those are the kind of questions we have to be asking ourselves instead.
Yeah. And I think that that is interesting. One of the things that I do notice is that a lot of times when AI is sort of being introduced into an area or workflow or something, I notice, especially in libraries, we have a number of workflows that are automated already. And so, like, there's already technology being used to help that. So, a specific example is when we do accessibility remediation on documents, specifically for people who need accommodations. And we've long been using like automated technology to improve the optical character recognition so that like a screen reader can pick up the words and letters in a document that's been digitized. But the accuracy of those tools was very bad.
Mm,
Like 50 to 60% accuracy. And that was like the best it was previously. And with AI enhanced optical character recognition, it's much better. Like somewhere in the 85 to 95% accuracy range.
mhm.
But people's expectation somehow is that introducing AI should be 100% perfect.
Yeah.
And so I do sort of notice sometimes there's a little bit of this like disconnect in the expectation.
Yeah.
And I think that I say this both because I think it relates to what we were just talking about, because it relates to my next question, which is that people may apply stricter expectations around transparency
Yeah.
to AI than they do to humans who are in a position to be sort of making decisions or doing something. And the reasoning or decision making of those humans is often like fairly opaque as well. Do we hold a different standard for AI than we do to or for expert humans? And I think my answer to this is yes, but I'm really curious on your take on the topic.
Yeah. So with this lead in, there are so many things blasting into my brain right now. Hopefully I can keep track of all of them.
Yeah.
So the first thing, I think and your example is maybe an example of this, that there can be a tendency to sort of like I can't think of better words right now, and I don't want it to sound too dismissive or something, but like vacuous alarmism, like this 98% accurate character recognizing system or whatever failed with this word and had significant consequences. What we should be asking ourselves is, okay, would we prefer that a human did it and it was at one trillionth the speed? Would we prefer, like, what are we hoping for?
Yeah.
And I think at that point, those pragmatic questions are reasonable. That said, and again, such a broken record. It really depends on the task context because,
Yeah.
when I think about this question of like fair standards and standards of comparison between AI and humans, this comes from Zerilli et al. 2019. Sometimes I teach that paper. I actually have every time I read an argument like this reaction, and this maybe ties into some of the things we were talking about earlier, that we, I don't think, at least, that we are usually that interested in the inner machinations of a particular individual's decision process, right? And so,
Hmm.
just to give the necessary context, the way the argument usually goes is, look, when humans make a decision, their reasoning is quite opaque to us. And in fact, they're often sort of like confabulating their reasons after. So there's like famous examples of this from Kahneman and Tversky and Klein and these other people. Um, uh, the one example that I really love is, I mean, I don't love it, it's kind of terrible, but that judges right before lunch give harsher sentences than right after
Hmm.
lunch.
Hmm.
So the idea is like, look, they think they're giving reasons based on like the record and the considerations presented to them in like legal documents or whatever. But really, it's because they were hungry. Um,
Yeah.
and if we're going to be fair to AI, then we should be okay with the level of opacity that AI have because it's actually quite similar to the human case. And as I said, I actually don't think that that's how we really behave. I think when we learn from Kahneman and Tversky and these other people that lunch has something to do with decisions, that matters to us, and it's a factor in our appraisal of the trustworthiness and the appropriateness of those judgments. And the problem is that we are sort of far more removed from the tools of corroborating or validating those decisions in in the case of some AI systems. And so I think the more appropriate question, I mean, on the one hand, there's a question, do should we be applying the same standards to AI that we apply to humans? I don't necessarily see why we should or should not. But separately, if we're going to say that we should apply the same standards, we should look really carefully at the way that those standards actually play out. And I mentioned earlier this sort of like logical positivism inspired idea of intersubjective, scrutiny and access to empirical information and other things which might corroborate a given truth proposition or whatever. Um, and I think that we do actually rely on those rather than a really good insight into whatever was going on cognitively in a person's brain. We want to know, the external abstract reasoning apparatus, was it logical, right? In light
Hmm.
of facts that we can all know and evidence, events, whatever that we can appraise. And if we find out that lunch seemed to have played an outsized role in a judgment, then
Yeah.
you know that that wasn't a good judgment, and
Mhm.
it's not that trustworthy. And we should maybe rethink the judgments that happened right before lunch or something, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I, I think that makes a lot of sense, and certainly relates to kind of the next thing that came up, which is that Mitchell's article really does sort of suggest that trust is most justified when we have some information about a system's track record and performance.
Mm.
From your perspective, what responsibilities do we have as hopefully learned and educated members of the public to help with that assessment and communication, and perhaps even with auditing the reliability or performance of AI tools before recommending them to others? And I ask this specifically because within the library context, we are often in the position of recommending or dissuading different kinds of information tools to people who come to us with questions about them.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, I mean, the track record is just one of many ways of sort of deciding, one of many sort of criteria you could use to decide whether to trust something. And I think Mitchell is recommending you know, deferring to reliability because there are a lack of other options. But I think I think that the track record is again maybe a, a case of tunnel vision with respect to how we operate in other domains. So, Mitchell gives the example of a firefighter, which he gets from Kahneman, seeming to just know when the roof is going to collapse in a fire or something, and the chess master who just knows, maybe without giving the full reasoning, that you should just resign now because you've given up the game or whatever. And those are two very particular kinds of examples, right? With the firefighter case, if the firefighter's wrong, it's still probably good to get out of the burning building. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? And with the chess case, it's like they could be right or they could be wrong. You'll probably learn something either way by either heeding or not
Mhm.
heeding the information given by the expert. But I think again that I would sort of want to push back on the idea that the track record is, and this will relate to the concerns about library sciences, I think, to push back on the idea that we do just rely on a track record in, like T1, T2 when an expert tells us something. And I can give another example from the medical context. If you go to the doctor and the doctor says, man, I really have a hunch that this is probably cancer. And these are really dark examples, obviously. But the stakes, of course, are a
Yeah.
relevant part of making our assessment. So if the doctor says, I have a hunch that you have cancer, you're not just going to start chemo, right? You're going to
Yeah.
they're going to like do a biopsy or whatever it
Yeah.
is they need to do. And that is in fact part of the constant sort of probing and auditing that gives the doctor the track record that you can sort of depend on. But in no case, basically, are you going to start chemo and radiation without going to some other sources besides your trust in that expert, to sort of corroborate their hunch. And so when it comes to information sciences, when it comes to just like dependability of research, Perplexity AI is a tool a lot of people like to use
Mm.
because it will produce, for the most part, real sources and stuff. I think that as long as it's feasible, that's obviously the gold standard in these epistemic contexts where all that matters is the truth, right? What we
Yeah.
care about is the truth and our best approximation thereof, that we should probably be continuously probing, right? To continuously ascertain that the track record that we're coming to rely on is still, um, uh, still what it is, what we think it
Yeah.
is. And so I do think that a context like information where like our whole raison d'etre is our best approximation of the truth, um, should be taking seriously that there's a need to sort of continuously audit, continuously probe, continuously check whether the track record is still
Mhm.
on track.
Yeah. No, I think that that makes a lot of sense. So I want to bring us in our sort of closing moments together, um, back back to our core issue of trust. So, library workers are in a somewhat unique position, in that we are often very highly trusted members of our communities. And the profession overall is often rated second only to nursing, in levels of trustworthiness. Given that very distinct positioning, how should library workers sort of position themselves on the spectrum of trust, skepticism, and distrust in relation to AI, as we're trying to support our communities with their AI use, but also not encourage sort of uncritical reliance and acceptance of it? So like we're really sitting in this very uncomfortable niche with trust in AI, which is part of why we were excited to speak with you today.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think in the ideal world, we would have some kind of like collaboration between like epistemologists and librarians and maybe domain experts for a whole bunch of different uh, um, um, knowledge generating fields or something, and we'd come up with some sort of framework for assessing the conditions of warrant for reliance for every, for a given instance. But given that that's such a lofty ideal and that there are deep epistemic problems with trying to come up with that in the first place, I think the best I can do is sort of make a observation and a hypothesis. So the observation is that librarians' whole job, well, not that I know what a librarian's whole job is. I don't. I'm completely ignorant of it. But my doctoral supervisor was in
yeah,
the information department at U of T, and so some proximate some
yeah.
proximate con contact. But that it's about facilitating research. It's about figuring out how knowledge is organized and how. Uh, I don't know. I think that library science is basically a branch of epistemology, a very practical and fostering of actual knowledge among actual individuals, discipline of epistemology. Um, and and so a big part of that job is checking and verifying um, and helping other people check and verify stuff that is purporting to be knowledge. And my hypothesis is that that is part of why people find librarians so trustworthy, is that if they don't know, they will look it up, right?
Yes.
And they will tell you how to look it up,
Yeah.
and they will show you the best practices and how to make sure that you're casting a wide enough net or a narrow enough net, or what a wide and narrow net even looks like, and all of those sort of like background things that make sense of our gigantic web of knowledge. Um, and so I think that taking that disposition to AI technology is probably the wise thing to do. And that might entail a little bit of skepticism.
Mm.
That the same sort of attitude that you might bring with any sort of like question or niche of inquiry or whatever, where you say, well, let's figure out how to figure out what this question means and what it would look like to answer it, and then what sort of like ancillary context there is to being able to answer it, and then hopefully we can find an answer, or we can find the avenue for how one could find out or whatever. That same sort of set of tools should probably be taken to the claims that are brought to us from our perspective ex nihilo from um, black box systems, because I think especially for people in the information sciences, and I think for people who are sort of like um, in any of these sort of like digging jobs where you're trying to
Mm.
figure out what is the case at all, like epistemic excavators or something,
Mhm.
um, that if not them, who is going to sort of be the auditor of these systems? And so my inclination is to say, bring that skepticism, bring those same tools of, you know, verify, inquire, investigate, um, to systems whose reasoning, justification, and rationale is not accessible to us.
Well, Thank you so much, Jessie. It's been such a delight to speak with you today. I know everyone is going to be really fascinated by our conversation. And I just want to invite everyone as a reminder, we will have our community conversations late in September, acknowledging that it's academic library's worst month. And so I would certainly encourage folks to join us for that.